Welcome everybody. We're just waiting for people to join us. Thanks very much for attending this very exciting event we've got lined up for you. So just as people are coming in, it'd be really lovely to see actually how many people are located at the moment in the north. If you could raise your hands just as people are coming in, it would be really great to see how many of you are in a relevant place for tonight's subject. There's quite a few hands being raised. That's fantastic. So at the moment we've got at least 10 people from the north. It'd be lovely actually as well if we knew if people were from the south, because you are, welcome into this northernness that we're talking about. So at the moment, we have quite a few people who are saying they're from the north. That's absolutely fantastic. And I'm going to lower all your hands now, and I'm going to ask for a show of hands from people who are not in the north, in a place that is not, you don't consider the north of England, just to give us an idea of who's joining us. So we have a couple of people. Is one of the Nigel? Are you not in the north? So you're very, very welcome, those of you who are not located in the north, and it's going to be an incredibly interesting discussion. So what I'm going to do as people are coming in, I'm going to talk through some housekeeping pointers. What I'd really like you to do is think about questions as we go along. And if you hover your cursor towards the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A button. And what you can do as the panelists are talking, you can pop a question in there and we'll sort through the questions and feed them into the discussion as we go. And then we'll leave some time at the end for questions as well. So have a think as people are talking about what you might want to ask the panelists. We'll just give it one more minute to allow people just to enter into the Zoom space. So you're very, very welcome. My name is Dr. Sharon Jagger. I'm a lecturer in religion at York St John University. So here you are at an event that is part of a series of research seminars that is hosted by the Centre for Religion in Society based at York St John. And if you want to keep up with that Centre for Religion in Society, you can go to blog.yorksj.ac.uk/CRIS, CRIS, that's Centre for Religion in Society, and keep up with all the things that we're doing. That would be brilliant. So before I introduce the panel, I just need to tell you that we are recording the session. So if you want to be anonymous when you ask your question and don't want your name broadcast out there is a box you can tick that allows you to ask your question anonymously. You'll also notice there are live captions. If that's distracting or you don't need them, you can also turn those off. So at the bottom of your screen, you will see a CC button. So just press that and you can turn those off. So I think that's everything I need to tell you as an audience. Very, very welcome. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our panel. I'm delighted this group of people are in the same space, actually. So firstly, there's Dr. Elli Wort, and she's Director of Studies with the Church Army. And her co-author is Reverend Canon Dr. Nigel Rooms, who also works for the Church Mission Society, as well as being a researcher. And he has a focus on cultural change in UK congregations. So their book, Fuzzy Church, has brought us together tonight about whether there is a northern expression of Christianity. And the big question we're asking tonight is God northern? And we're joined also by Dr. Kate Fox, poet, author, comedian, and a regular guest on national radio and national television, as well as touring with her own live shows. And her doctoral research focuses on class, gender, and Northern identity. And the interesting thing is, Nigel and Elli have drawn on Kate's work quite substantially for their research too. So it's been brilliant to bring you guys together to discuss this idea of whether God is a Northern woman. So I'm going to start off actually by inviting Nigel and Elli to talk us a little bit through the premise of the research and your book, Fuzzy Church. What brought that about, and why the north of England? Why has that featured in your research?
Yeah, so maybe I should kick off because it starts way back in my life. I worked for 7 years in Africa a long time ago. And the big question in African Christianity is, how can I be African and Christian when the Christianity I've inherited is a Western thing and is finding a new life here in Africa? And so the question of how faith and culture, or faith and context, engage with each other was very live there. And I suppose I've been working with that question back here in England for quite a long time now. I worked on it in relation to Englishness as a whole, but then the question of the North came up because I was born in the North. I don't live in the North now, I live in Leicester, but nevertheless, I still support the football team in my hometown, Hull City. And I count myself as a Northerner. And I've always for a long time realized how othered the North is in the country as a whole. There's a big line somewhere between the Bristol Channel and the Wash, between the southeast and the north, and all sorts of demographics play out along that line. And only, of course, in this last week have we had the othering playing itself out in the way in which HS2 was shifted in its in its overall aim and objective. And what do you expect then? This goes on and on and on. And I suppose that's the thing that brings us to our particular research. We wanted to look at, well, how does all this affect the churches in the North? And what does that othering do to them? And is there anything actually gifted and particular and graced even about the North that actually could be good for the church and for the good news as Christians understand it? I think that's probably enough from me. Elli?
Yeah. So I think that Nigel just described the deep roots of this book, as it were, but it also came, some of the impetus for the research came from a day conference, and I think it was 2013, wasn't it?
Yeah, way back, yeah.
At Bishopthorpe Palace, when Nigel and Gavin Wakefield from the Diocese of York gathered a group of people together to start exploring the question of, is there a Northern gospel? Is there something we could call a Northern gospel? And out of that day conference came the book, where are we? Northern Gospel, Northern Church, edited by Nigel and Gavin. And in that book, there's a chapter from Nigel sort of diving deep into some of these issues. And Bishop Philip North reviewed the book, loved the book, liked the book, was intrigued by the book, wanted Nigel to go deeper into that question of, is there such a thing as a Northern gospel? And we were able to receive funding from the Susanna Wesley Foundation, who we're very grateful to, and they helped us, they helped provide some funding for us to do a bit of field research with churches in the north of England to start tackling some of these questions.
Actually, that reminds me that my chapter in that book was called Bias to the North, ? And that's about the idea that in the Bible, God is biased towards the marginalized, towards the poor. And couldn't we see actually part of the gospel in England being about a deliberate, intentional bias to the North, when it looks like a lot of the power and the money and the resources in the church are in the South? And that was a deliberate kind of move on our part.
So what are your most interesting and surprising findings? And just while you're thinking about that, if the audience want to feed in questions as we go along, just click that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you missed me saying that at the beginning, and you can pop your questions in there and we will ask the panelists as we go along. But if just give us a flavour of what came out of the research that has surprised you.
Yeah, well, I think the first one was that we were pretty rubbish at designing the research. Kind of had this basic idea that there was some kind of immediate surface connection between gospel and culture, between the gospel and the North. And of course, that actually, as we discovered, was quite what we call an essentialist approach to culture and culture itself. And that didn't really help us at all. And that got quickly blown away by the research, which was a good thing. It was what we call an excellent failure. So that was the first thing. And then I think, for me, one of the things I think that came out of it was this idea that, okay, the church in the north of England, in lots of places, is really struggling, and lots of churches are closing. And yet, we were looking at churches where, as we said, something is happening, where people were finding new faith in Christ and becoming Christian. And that was really interesting, given the backdrop of what we call the end of Christendom, the way in which actually the culture used to, push people into church, and now it doesn't do that at all. It pushes them away from it. Yet these churches were bucking that trend. So what was it about these places that were able to do that? Well, the key thing for me about that was that they were actually doing it. And that puts the North, if you like, and learning about how to be church in our current time at what I call the forefront of the future, because I can guarantee you that that same effect is going to happen, all over the country in time. It's just that it takes longer in some places than others. And so there's a real sense in which actually we can learn something really beautiful from these kinds of churches that are trying new things and discovering new ways of being church in their communities as they find them. Elli.
I think one of the things that surprised me again came from a mistake we made. We probably shouldn't mention our mistakes right at the top, but when we started to try and find churches where something was happening, where God might be at work, that we could try and research and find out what's happening here. How is God at work in these northern churches? We got in touch with people all across dioceses, across the north of England, with people in Methodist districts, and asked the question, where are the churches that are really flourishing in their communities? Where can we find those? Who are those people we should be speaking to? And I think we discovered pretty quickly that the word flourishing was a really unhelpful one to use. We had, I remember chatting to one bishop who said, well, there's this church where something's happening, but it's not flourishing. In fact, it's really quite fragile. And I'd rather you didn't actually go and research there, because I think what's happening is so fragile. I don't want a couple of researchers turning up and poking into it. And that was one of our first findings, that although something is happening, it's actually quite fragile. It's not something you might say is strong or flourishing. It's something that's maybe quite small and fragile.
I think one more surprise that's happened for me after we've finished the work was in doing this kind of gig this evening. I did a little pop-up session at the Greenbelt Arts Festival. I don't know if some of you familiar with that festival, but August Bank Holiday. Anyway, I did a little pop-up session there, and a bloke came and he said to me afterwards, he said, I've been coming to Greenbelt for 15 years, and this is the first time anyone's ever talked about the North.
Wow.
And
that is something, yeah.
And so what's been great is people in the North have said, oh, you're actually seeing us and we're being seen, recognize ourselves in this research. And that's really great. And that's a lovely surprise.
Thanks both. That really sets the scene, actually. And I'm going to orientate us back to the idea of a northern identity. So Why have two theologians drawn on research from a stand-up poet who has researched from the performance field? Why has Kate's research been so important to you?
Well, since Elli found it, she needs to start on this one.
Well, I've been to see Kate's show, Where There's Muck, There's Bras, and I knew of Kate's work. And so as we were starting to do, you do your research on the ground, but you do lots of reading as well around the topics. And Kate's work, I think, really stood out to us because three of the big things that she found in her research really chimed with what we found in our research. We found that three really distinctive characteristics of the gospel, of where God was at work in churches in the north of England. There was a sense of authenticity, of community, and of humour. And we weren't actually expecting humour to come out as much as we did. I think in our first, when you generate all this data and we go over it and we read each other's field notes and interviews and everything, and we came up with some sort of very academic sounding categories and everything. And then as we were talking about it and going back over our notes and things, we noticed the amount of times we laughed when we were doing the research. I remember one particular group I did where I was meant to be talking with the church leaders about, desperately important things. We had such a good time. I laughed so much. And so actually, humour was one of the really important characteristics of God at work in the north of England, how the gospel happens in the north of England. And so it seems really appropriate to be talking to a poet and performer and comedian because humour is really integral.
This is a research seminar, so we ought to get a bit academic.
Go on then.
So I think the field we're working in is some combination of what you might call practical or theology, missiology, contextual theology. All those disciplines are what we call interdisciplinary, in the sense that they're not discrete in themselves. They draw on other disciplines and make sense of the world from all sorts of different perspectives. Theology, practical theology, draws on all sorts of psychology, sociology, anthropology, wherever. And of course, now we can add in performance studies from Kate. And it was just great to be able to that is interdisciplinary work in this piece and be really brought up short.
And from the point of contextual theology, more of the nature of God can be discovered by looking at different disciplines and different fields, different contexts. So we would say we don't have all the answers, actually, that we want to learn from people like Kate and what might come out from her research as well.
So I'm going to draw in Kate now. It seems like you come from a very different perspective to the kind of theology that's been discussed so far, Kate. So how's that left you feeling that your research has been picked up and used in this particular way?
Well, just first of all, really chuffed and overjoyed actually to see, because I wanted my research to be useful above all, but I was aware that because my research was sitting not just within performance studies, but within the field of comedy studies, where automatically really that research can be overlooked, devalued. It's just comedy, it's just humour, that's not important. So for its usefulness to be recognised was wonderful. And maybe a little bit of me actually. So I thought it was quite hard to justify my position sometimes as a PhD researcher who was coming from the perspective of being a comedian. But I imagine it's potentially sometimes more of a challenge to justify your research coming from the position of being a Christian. And actually, there are certain ways in which you then have to think very fuzzily I love the idea of the fuzziness. That's what I had to do too. My research is very interdisciplinary. And that fuzzy thinking, saying, look at all these boundaries we are crossing from our positions. It's really productive and powerful, and uncovers connections that you would not have thought. So I'd never thought this would be used, my research would be used in a theological context, in the context of wondering whether God's northern, and I'm very glad it was.
So, Kate, just give us a flavour of how you would define the northern identity from your perspective, from the research that you've done.
Basically, it's an identity that is sometimes, as Nigel and Elli have said, stigmatised and othered, in the kind of half of the north-south binary that constitutes England. It's in the bottom half most of the time. On the other hand, because of the attachment to these positive values of authenticity, community, humour, lack of pretension, there is potentially capital gain to be made in northernness. Occasionally, I am a professional northerner. Basically, some of the gigs I get, some of the work I get, some of the radio opportunities I get are because I sound northern. And there's something about that sounding northern voices. For me, so much of this is carried in the voice and the body. And I discovered that, well, you can separate northernness from a voice and a body, but usually when that northernness is being perceived from the outside, it is inseparable from a voice and a body.
And how does that play into class? Did your research find, all three of you, did your research find that northern identity and the sound of the north, did that have some sort of meaning making when it comes to assumptions about class? And does that make barriers for people?
Can I answer that briefly, and then pass on to Nigel and Elli? So for me, because there is such a strong projection and introjection of the idea of sounding northern as working class, and then with a kind of subheading of probably white, probably male, then the more northern you sound, the more you will be perceived as having those characteristics, even if they're clearly, for me, I'm female, I'm present as female, and yet some of the ways that I'm read are, it's all intersectionally very interesting, essentially. And I got so many people, though, during my research. The most common thing, I felt like I should offer a counselling service to people who grew up with a northern accent and lost it somewhere along the way, mostly women, and would very apologetically be like, I am northern, I just don't sound northern. And I'd be like, it's okay. I'd practically take confession of them. I'd be like, I see you, I see your northernness, bless you, in your now inaudible northernness. And that's all a bit complicated too.
And it goes back to the visibility stroke invisibility that is mixed up in the identity of being northern. And I've had lots of discussions about sounding northern and how sometimes that makes me feel alienated certainly from certain institutions like the church. When I was young, I felt very alienated because vicars didn't sound like me or look like me with beards and things. So that has left me with some sort of residual feeling non-belonging because of the way I sound and the class signifiers that I do have. So Elli and Nigel, what about you? Did you find something similar in your research?
Class was really interesting in our research. I think, Nigel, would it be fair to say it's something that's not always talked about in church circles?
Hardly ever, as Sharon's just pointed out, yes.
Yeah, but it did come up as quite frequently in our groups talking to church leaders and also in people who'd recently become Christians. They mentioned it as well. I think one of the most interesting, a church which perhaps is an exemplar of how class was understood and negotiated was the recognition that church leadership is very often middle class. And they can be put into areas or choose, go to work in areas which are very deprived, very working class, experiencing a lot of poverty. And the churches that we researched where something was happening, where God was at work, were very honest about that, recognized that, were able to talk about it, and where leaders were able to, we would say, live incarnationally. They didn't live in the posh vicarage a few miles away from the estate. They lived in the estate. They became part of the group of people that they were working among.
I think they were also prepared to be changed by them as well.
Yes.
There was this fuzziness which actually, the middle class leaders were able to say, actually, this experience of being with these people and ministering with them has changed us. And so often, of course, what Shannon was describing is the aloof middle class church leader who is just above all this stuff. And it's all happening in some other place. And this wasn't the case at all. These people were genuinely finding new life and new humanity, new ways of being themselves, actually, in relation to these people who they were with, which again was a really beautiful thing to see.
We've got a question from an audience member, Pauline Kollontai, which is really relevant right now. So she's asking, what was it that the new expressions of church in the North were doing that attracted and retained people in terms of its theological message and activities? And this gets to the absolute crux of your research, actually, this Northern expression of Christianity.
Nigel, do you want to start on that one?
Well, so the key idea that we present in the title of the book is what we've already referred to several times, this idea of fuzzy church. So that's actually a quote from one of our church leaders who said that, there it is, who said that essentially when she noticed that actually people were joining her church and finding faith, she couldn't really tell when it was happening. It was just that at one point they weren't, and somehow then they were. And at the fuzzy edge of the church, at some point they kind of flipped over into faith. And that then, as we picked up that idea, we realized that was common actually to all the research churches in different ways, but they were all able somehow to create that fuzzy edge, which, in contrast to churches that have what you might call a thick boundary around them, where there's quite a big jump to make from being out and then being in. And of course, that can be very off-putting to very many people. Whereas these places were this sense of actually it's okay to be on the edge and to be exploring, to have questions, to doubt, not even to be part of the church at all, but still to be associated. There was one church that had a pagan lady running a kids club at their local food bank, and it was okay. It was fine. She was committed to their project. That kind of sense of fuzziness. Really key, because I think what that does for churches is it makes them alive to their communities. It means they are being changed, as we just said about the class question, by the people who are coming in, and of course they're able to go out then in a different way, and they're not just fixed in their little kind of club, sealed off from their northern context. And so, of course, as they do that fuzziness, they have to engage with the culture that's out there, whether it is northerners, class, whatever it is. And of course, that engagement in itself changes them as they discover that. Is that?
And I think that,
yeah.
I hope I haven't misunderstood the question, but the first words in it were something along the lines of what expressions of church or new, is that right, Sharon?
Yes.
Yes. And then I think it's we looked at some places where there were new expressions of church. For example, the church that Nigel was just referring to had started a new worshipping community. But sometimes this was a continuation of existing services that were happening, existing forms of church. More often, it came after something had died. A church had closed, or there was one instance where the church building had closed and the last church warden threw the keys at the archdeacon. That was how badly and acrimoniously it had closed. But a new something had grown up in its place, not in the previous church building, but in the home of the minister working there. So when we say something new, it very often happened after something had failed or died, and that was very important.
And the other thing I think that's in relation to the word fuzzy is not just at the boundary, but also inside the worship, as it were. The worship was actually quite fuzzy in the sense that what the post-colonialists called hybrid. It was drawing from all sorts of different places, from all over the place, and was being made unique in that particular time and place. In Kate's terms, it was being performed in the here and now of the worship event, and we deliberately set out to stay and participate in all the places that we visited and researched and took part in the worship. And that was a fascinating thing to notice that connectivity between them as well, that somehow this worship thing was alive and people wanted to be part of it, and it wasn't just drawing on one particular thing. It was coming from very many different sources.
We've got a couple of related questions from audience members, specifically about the cohort involved in your research. So the first one is, what was the socio-economic profile and deprivation index of the churches you worked with, if you know it in that detail? And the second one is, was there any difference in churches where the leaders sound northern and who are northern, and the churches where they weren't northern? Did you find a difference between those two?
Nigel, do you want me to take the first one and you can do the second?
Yeah, go on, yes.
Go on. So when we chose our churches that we were going to research, we were really conscious of wanting to choose, recognizing that the North is not one thing. We are not looking at as an essentialist North here. So we tried to make sure that we were visiting churches from a range of socioeconomic backgrounds. Flicking very quickly through the book, Fuzzy Church, I note that one of the places that we visited was the third poorest parish in the UK, pretty much. But there were others that were ranked sort of more middling towards the socioeconomic makeup of the country. We also made sure that we visited churches that were urban, that were rural, that were coastal, because the coast obviously has its own set of socioeconomic demands that aren't the same as urban or rural. We visited churches from a range of church traditions: evangelical, more high church, Anglican and Methodist, small, large. So we tried to get we tried to ensure there was variety in the churches that we looked at.
And we recognise it's a small sample, and yet, the vast majority of them were in the 50% most deprived communities in the country, and that might be evidence again that God is biased to the poor. Who knows?
I am going to, just to warn you as panelists, I am going to press you at some point on the actual question, is God northern? So
sure.
Brace yourselves, that is coming, folks.
The second question on this one, this was about, about the leaders, yes, right. So we were interested in the question of, were these people, the leaders, Indigenous Northerners or not? And actually, what was really interesting on that question was that many of them had started off in the North, had moved somewhere else, whether further north, abroad or south, and then come back. And that was really interesting, that they had that sense of, I'm really committed to this place because this is where I'm from, but actually I've got a bigger sense of the world from somewhere else. and now I'm coming back to commit myself to this place. And in a sense, what they brought from those other experiences was really valuable in their leadership, because they had a bigger sense of the wider world. That's not to say that there weren't, people who stayed in one place all their lives who were leading in churches who were really, really valuable. But the majority of the people that we actually worked with actually had that experience, which we thought was a really interesting take on that question.
Thanks for that. I want to bring Kate in, if I may. In the Fuzzy Church book, there's an amazing quote that is, "Northernness is a form of sympathetic magic, which Northerners choose to perform." And that seems to really resonate with the perspective that you bring in terms of performance, and especially you saying that sometimes you're a professional Northerner, so there's a sense of performance there. What do you make of that, as some sort of sympathetic magic? I'm going to throw that back to Elli and Nigel as well, to kind of unpack what they were saying about that in the book. How does that resonate with you, Kate?
Yeah, no, it resonates hugely, although I think Carl Spracklin, who said that, kind of has a more pessimistic conclusion about what that means, about what's then possible in terms of breaking the magic of Northernness and changing the myth. But I always think back to, I think Northerners will generally recognise a wink, an irony in "we are now performing Northernness." And I think outsiders may not recognise that. So I think of a conversation that I had at Northallerton train station, where I asked for a cup of tea from the bloke behind the kiosk. And he said, "Will that be Yorkshire tea?" And I was like, "Yes, your finest Yorkshire tea." And he said, "Grown on the slopes of Sutton Bank." Yes. And we were performing a Northernness to amuse each other, as people do all the time. But as I say, I think maybe a passing Southerner may not have picked, well, they probably would, that was quite blatant, but generally the layers of irony are not picked up. Sympathetic magic, meaning, of course, that those performances of Northernness have impact, real effects. I found economic effects on comedians and performers. Some positive economic effects of this performed Northernness, some negative. It lives, it does stuff, it functions. But I think maybe I speak as audible Northerners, need to be a little more careful sometimes about the impacts and effects it has.
Elli and Nigel, have you got anything just to add to that?
Since we're performing Northerners, I've got to get my joke in somewhere. So here we go. Okay, and this is relevant to the main question of the evening: is God Northern? Okay, so Jesus and the Father are talking in heaven, and Jesus says to the Father, "Where have you been for the last 18 months? I haven't seen you around." The Father says, "I've been in Yorkshire." Jesus says, "What have you been doing there? There's been a global pandemic on. Working from home, son, working from home."
Thank you. I'm sure there is a ripple of laughter across the north and in pockets of the south that we can't hear. Thank you for that, Nigel.
So here's the thing. On the one hand, you have, and this happened on Sunday with us, we did a little kind of precursor thing on the radio on Sunday, and in Radio Merseyside and Radio York. And on Radio Merseyside, they signed off this question of God Northern with the idea that, oh yeah, I can see God with a flat gap and eating his egg and chips. And of course, you just end up in those, what we call now essentialist stereotypes of Northerners, which are really unhelpful and disappointing. On the other hand, Carl Spracklin ends up in, I think, as Kate says, a very pessimistic place, that there's actually no centre to this thing, that it has really no actual grounding or meaning. And I suppose as Christians, as theologians, we want to say, if God is the creator of everything that is, then surely God is available somewhere in Northernness. And we think that Kate put her finger on at least some of those things in authenticity, community humour, lack of pretension. And we wanted to celebrate those things and say, actually, they are good and beautiful things. and can't we work with those? And we were just, again, so grateful for that insight into the deeper meaning of Northernness beyond the surface essential stereotypes.
So we're creeping closer to our climactic question, which we're still going to hold off a little bit and get the tension going. But Elli, I wonder if you could answer these two questions which are related to what we've just been talking about. So Mark says, and actually Kate, this is very relevant as well to you, so do chip in. Mark Dawson is asking, I am one of those people you mentioned who have lost their northern accent and have become very posh. For those of us who have lost their northern accents, what do you think are the characteristics of northernness that remain, and how does this relate to church going? Let's unpack that one first, and there's another one that also comes off the back of that.
I think how it relates to church going is a really interesting question, isn't it? And perhaps the answer is depending on where you go to church. Whether that makes a difference if you're in the south or if you're in the north or one of the other regions, I don't know. I think there is Kate, do you want to answer while I'm thinking? Because that's a really good question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I was, because I don't want to essentialize about northernness, but it's likely that someone who grew up with a northern accent and steeped in a northern cultural way of talking and expressing themselves probably would tend to express themselves perhaps more directly with more, I'm going to say, even though I partly did a PhD to debunk this, with more humour and with more calling a spade. I will so often end up, and actually in your research, Nigel and Elli, there's a point where you talk about how somebody in a church felt like they got more honest answers to their questions. In fact, you got more honest answers, I think, to your questions, was it? Or someone in a meeting got more honest answers?
No, it was the Bishop of Burnley when he was being interviewed. I interviewed him as a kind of background interview to this, and he came from London. And he got the job in Burnley, and he was given 2 hours or 3 hours with the two archdeacons in Burnley. And he said to me, I was absolutely shocked because they answered every single question that he asked openly and honestly with what they thought was the truth, which was completely opposite to his experience in London, where nobody would ever tell any truth to anybody. They would always be disseminating about the real answer to the question. I mean, just listen to what happens in Parliament, for goodness sake, it was a reality. And
there's something there about that being actually a gospel value, we could argue as Christians, that truth telling and not disseminating feels very gospel-y. That feels that attention to truth feels very Jesus-like, I think, to me. And just reflecting on that, Nigel and I did we did a bit of a 3-day workshop a couple of weeks ago about some of these topics, and a guy who'd signed up to the course just after the first session said to me, "Is this going to be worth my time?" And the bit of I was born in the south, you see, and that bit of residual southerner got her back up and thought, well, that's very rude of you. He was being entirely honest. Was this going to be worth his time or not? He wanted to know. And I think I was able to persuade him it probably was. But there's something about that directness, bluntness, which is something to be treasured and honoured, and to be it's a gospel-y type value, I think.
That's really...
Well, just one more thing. Kate in her book, just to big up Kate again, it talks about, in her research, she talks about affirmation and resistance. That's very relevant here for people like our friend Mark. So affirming, what's good about your northernness and resisting the othering of it by people who would do that. Not in the what we call the chip on the shoulder way, which is what we often fall into, I think, in the North, but in a way that actually is just assertive about who we are. This is who I am. This is where I was born. Okay, I've lost my accent, but actually, I'm still this Northern person, and I'm going to be like this, and that's okay. Yeah.
And just just weaving into that conversation, you know, especially for somebody who maybe has lost that key signifier of the accent. There's a question from somebody: do you encounter people who struggle to establish a definition beyond their northernness, and that label prevents others from seeing their other qualities? You know, are we kind of so steeped in northernness that everything else is sort of invisible?
I think it's that essentialist reading of the North again, that it's seen as very two-dimensional. So to be Northern comes, you know, in a lot of people's minds, comes with that flat pack of stereotypes of the flat cap, the whippet, the, you know, the barm cake if you were from Sheffield with your chips in it. Yeah.
For me, I feel like there is far more scope, though, to resist that essentializing in the church than there is in comedy, because in comedy there are a lot of Northern comedians who are read simply as club comics, or you know, read as if they are still in the 70s, just because they sound and look a bit like a Bernard Manning type of comedian, and they might be doing very sophisticated self-written material that's a million miles away from Bernard Manning, but somehow by critics in newspapers, I analysed 260 newspaper reviews, somehow their qualities are not recognised, and their voices and bodies are commented on far more than the voices and bodies of Southern comedians. Whereas at least in the church, I do think there's an interest, there's already a fluidity going on, a bit of a surprising, oh, so you're Northern, but you've, you know, undertaken a deep study of theology that you're now sharing with us. There's already an interesting cross mix. I can't remember the name of the popular vicar. I want to say she's called Jane. She's on Radio 2.
Kate Botley?
Oh, she's not even called Jane. Kate, yes. I'm intrigued by her, actually, because she does full on, couldn't be any more Northern, look at my Northernness. Then she segues into, anyway, the other day when I was reading the Bible deeply, and I'm always a bit like, whoa, nice resistance to what Northernness can and should be.
That's really fascinating. And another question from Pauline: would you say that Fuzzy Church is in some ways a reaction to and response to the political and economic injustices that exist between North and South? And this has really been buzzing around my mind, Nigel and Elli, where you talk about this sort of colonising effect of the South in the North. And that was quite shocking language to me when I read the book. And I think this question, it kind of draws on that as well. So would you say that you know, you're reflecting that kind of economic reality between the North and South?
Well, I mean, it's lovely to hear that from someone as a question, because I think that's what, in a sense, we're hoping for from this book, that actually we could raise that question, and that these churches that we researched could be held up as examples that stand against, yes, that power and money thing that so often drives things that happen in larger church bodies. That actually in these small fragile places where something is happening, that does stand up against this colonial othering. We call it coloniality in the book. It's not colonialism in its traditional sense, but there is this sense that, as I said earlier on, that the country does do that to the North in real economic ways, as we saw last week. So, you know, we are attempting a theological levelling up, if you want to, the current government's terms. And that's a really important thing, we think, in relation to how the gospel works and how God seems to be biased to the marginalised.
Yeah.
And can I just bring in, Ivan's asked a couple of questions that are very, sorry, my dog's trying to break into the room. Ivan's suggesting that actually some of the characteristics you've been talking about are abundant in the South, in London, and he's describing Pentecostal churches that are growing and are large congregations, equally in London and the southeast as well as in Bradford. So there is a kind of mirroring effect. So that sort of challenges the discourse that we've run along with at the moment. How do you respond to that?
Well, I always think that London is an exception in England in every possible way because it's the capital. So I'm not surprised that you can find a similar effect in London. It is just, even on sociological terms, it's an exception in relation to everywhere else. So we do have to take that into account when we think about London. But also, none of this is saying that God is not active and at work in the South and in London and in other places at all. What we are trying to do is simply to foreground, to showcase the North and what it does, because so often our talk about the church gravitates to the South and the Southeast because that's where the money and the power and actually, things are happening. And of course, the church in London is growing in all sorts of ways that is great, but it's different to the rest of the country.
And just as Fuzzy Church sort of moved on from Northern Gospel, Northern Church, maybe the next bit of research is to identify, like, well, okay, we've tried to pull out these characteristics of God at work in the North. What are the signs of God at work in the Southeast? Of God at work in London? Does that look similar? Does it look different? What are the overlaps? What does God at work in Cornwall look like? In Northern Ireland, in Scotland, in Wales, in other places where people are distanced from power and decision-making, political decision-making. Could you argue that places like Grenfell or, places of real rural poverty in Cornwall are northern in as much as they are similar in terms of distance from political power and decision-making?
That's really interesting. And there's a question from Christine that says, is there a case for levelling up of church resources and investment? So getting down to the, the nuts and bolts of it, if you like, in terms of the economic differentials. Should the church be sorting that out?
I think in my optimistic moods, I'd say yes, absolutely. In my pessimistic moods, I'd say it's far too late for that. You have to learn what happens when churches die and close, actually. And that's what we've been looking at in the north of England. And I hope some of the message that we share is that churches may die and close, but that does not stop God's work. So actually, it's less a case of levelling up the church in the north of England. It's more saying to the church in more affluent areas of the country, please come and learn what happens here, because we think it's going to be happening to you in the next 10 or 20 years.
Genuinely, I think, perhaps not in terms of financial resources, maybe as Elli says, it's a bit too late for that. But in terms of human resource, I do think that there's a question about how people are called and where they're called to minister, because I can guarantee you that for every clergy job in London, there are probably 15, 20 applications, and every job in Durham or Carlisle or wherever it is in the north, you might, if you're lucky, if you get one or two. Now, is it that God is calling all those people to the south or to the north, or is it just our inherent bias and we don't want to go there? I think that's a reality that would really do with some serious engagement with, and actually, maybe some bishops saying, well, I'm sorry, but you need to move north, mate, and get on with it.
Well, with that does sort of point us to our slightly provocative question, I'll admit. But it's not tongue-in-cheek particularly. I think it's quite a serious question that we're finally asking. Is God northern? I'm going to start off with Kate, because you might have a sort of stoical answer to this, Kate, I feel.
Well, in order to answer this question, I'm going to have to do a certain amount of inner translation, speaking as mostly a pagan Buddhist-ish. But recently, I feel like I have seen God at work in village halls during my rural touring, village halls in the north of England, where those values of community and people coming together in solidarity in a very fuzzy way. Actually, it turns out lots of my audiences last week for a show about Doctor Who and autism. Doctor Who, another transmitter of very Christian values, have to say. Lots of the people in those audiences were connected to the local church, but were also connected to all sorts of other things in their villages. Someone casually talked about bread church. I was like, what's bread church? And apparently they get together in the village hall, they make bread together and talk and do churchy things, and then cook the bread and eat it together. I was like, that sounds like the best thing that's ever happened. And the sort of performance I love, the sort of comedy I love, that is also about kindness and community and people sharing and people connecting, that's also happening in village halls and smaller comedy clubs. And it is more northern than not. It's everywhere, of course, but it is a lot in the north. That's my answer.
Thanks, Kate. Elli, what would you say?
Well, oh gosh, so many things. I would say that as a there's a theological concept called Missio Dei, which says that God's mission in the world, basically, well, part of the idea of it is that it doesn't have to have much to do with churches, really, that God can be at work throughout God's creation. And God is inviting Christians and the church to join in. So I would totally agree with Kate that those are signs of God at work in the world. I'd probably put a slightly different spin on it from her, but I totally agree with that. And in response to the question of, is God northern? There is, in our book, we quote a Brazilian bishop, Pedro Casaldaglia. I'm sorry if you're Brazilian, I got that wrong. Who says the universal word speaks only local dialect. So the universal word, who Christians would describe as God, only speaks in a local dialect. We can only know God through our own contexts. And so, of course, God's northern, of course, because there are people in the north who know God, and they know God as relevant to them and found in their communities. That's not to say that God isn't Southern or Irish or Welsh or Scottish, but God is utterly northern. I think some of the bits that moved me most in our research were people talking about new Christians who'd come newly to faith and who God was to them and how especially they knew the person of Jesus. And we had somebody who talked about, we had chats about, would Jesus shop at Lidl or Aldi? Big discussions. We didn't find a theological answer to that. But I'll always remember somebody describing Jesus as being just like somebody who'd just sit on the bus and there'd be something about him. And you just know he was something a bit different, a bit special. So yes, to our participants and to me, God is on the bus in the north of England.
Nigel?
Well, just to take that back to what they call the Christ of history, you know, Jesus was born in Nazareth, grew up there, ministered for his 3 years in a tiny little triangle on the north of Lake Galilee, about 3 kilometers by 3 kilometers between Capernaum, Bethsaida, and somewhere else. And that was a very, very particular place for a very, very particular time. And yet something universal has come out of that, that we call the Christian faith, which now finds itself here in England, amazingly, 2,000 years later. And every local church is, as an expression of that, is a complete miracle when you think about it, because that's really weird that we're connected to that bloke, in that very small place 2,000 years ago. But there it is. And so in that sense, absolutely God is northern because, well, first of all, Jesus was in northern Palestine, so folks, and the relationship with northern Palestine and Jerusalem was just the same. In fact, it sounds to me, in those days, because that was where all the power was, in Jerusalem, and he had to go there occasionally. But look what happened there when he got there. Wasn't great, was it? So in that sense, yes, of course, God is northern, because God reveals God's self through particularities, through our own place. And if that doesn't happen, then we are just going to end up in some colonial world where we're imposing our faith on people. And faith has to actually find its rooting, its cashing out, its grounding in our local place. And that's why I wanted to celebrate northernness and these northern churches in the book.
On that note, thank you very much, all three of you. We have run out of time, but it's a resounding yes. She is northern indeed. And all I can say is thank you so much for your time and generosity, folks. We've still got questions from the audience, and I'm so sorry we didn't get a chance to answer them all, but there are some quite challenging questions about whether we are homogenising northernness, what the differences are between Yorkshire and Lancashire, and those sorts of things. We're going to have a rematch, I think, and there's a lot of sociological stuff that we could draw out. So thanks so much, and thank you to everybody who's asked questions, everybody who's attended and listened, and I hope you've really enjoyed it. I have. And yeah, we'll certainly have to do a revisit of some of these issues. Thanks so much, folks, and take care. See you later, everybody, and thanks for coming.